There were back-to-back some great videos recently from various YouTubers whose profiles I'll put in the link in the description to this video so you can check out their own videos on this subject. But each of these YouTubers has been releasing a video where they list out 10 very difficult books that they plan to read, that they want to read, and then they have this little parentheses about how you don't have to read it. There's no pressure on you. There's nothing lesser about you for not wanting to read these books. And I really like this format for a video. I like the idea of it because what it allows for is for us, the booktubers, to be fully embracing of our tastes and our interests, what it is that we aspire to as readers in terms of the big books that we're looking forward to in the future. And we get to just express that, but we're not putting any kind of push back onto the viewer saying, oh no, you have to read this, you have to enjoy this just because I enjoy it. I like that kind of individualized recommendation that this brings. But it also allows for us to just talk about difficult books or really long books and just to do so without any kind of judgment in either direction. So I want to partake in this very quickly with my own video. I have a list of actually 11 books, but it's really going to be 10, and then the 11th is just going to be a little addendum at the end. And these are books that I know are probably going to be very difficult for me to read down the line, but I really look forward to them for various reasons, and I'll cover why it is that I want to read these books. So, to get started, I thought it would be fitting to begin with a genre that most people would find difficult and probably not want to read, but that ends up being very, very interesting to me, and that is philosophy, and specifically the subgenre within philosophy of meta-ethics, which is pretty heady, often very dense, convoluted, and because of the nature of it, ends up not really getting you to any practical end per se. It often can feel like an argument of definitions more than anything else, and that could be really, really irritating to people. However, I find the value in books like that to be merely thought experiments or ways of thinking through an idea. It feels to me very often like a lot of the meta-ethical arguments ends up being just ways of framing your understanding of something, and by just allowing yourself to dip within those waters of that framing, you are allowing yourself to just experiment with your own thought process and to respond back and forth between what's on offer and what you feel in regards to that. And I think that as merely a practice is worth doing and very satisfying. At least it is for me. This first book that I chose is not just one volume or 2 volumes or 3 volumes, but actually 4 volumes coming together into one single work, and that is On What Matters by Derek Parfit. So if you know anything about ethics, you know that Derek Parfit is a philosopher famous for his first book, which is called Reasons and Persons. And in that book, this is one that I actually read a while back. In that book, he goes through multiple different kinds of arguments. He first breaks down the self-defeating qualities of a lot of ethical principles, and he goes into the nature of self, or at least self as a kind of description. And then he introduces this notion of population ethics, or thinking about the ways in which the decisions that we make in life end up leading to branching outcomes in the future, such that any moral decision you make is not going to affect the same group of people. The people who exist in the world are going to be different depending on the different kinds of policies or society-wide choices that end up being made. So that was Reasons and Persons. And I found it a really nice exercise to read that book and to just sort of think about my own criticisms of it or agreements with it. And so at some point, I want to get to his 4-volume On What Matters. I want to actually dive into his much broader attempt to take on meta-ethics, to try and take on what would be the proper system to follow in an ethical framework. And as far as I understand, the conclusion that he ends up reaching is something along the lines of a combination between Kantian deontology and utilitarian ethics. And I don't know how he combines it because I haven't read the books yet, But it is, as far as I know, his best attempt to try and make the case that it has to be a combination of the two. And in fact, they do not conflict like most people would assume, but actually coincide quite smoothly with one another. Now, ultimately, I wonder if he can somehow make the case that these normative systems must be adopted, because I don't know how you can make the case that we must adopt a system. That seems nearly impossible to make, and yet it would be interesting if he tries to do something like that. As far as I know, he passed on before he could actually do another volume of this book. So for all I know, it's going to be very unsatisfying to finish it. But if you're interested in meta-ethics or challenges to ethical systems, it is a good book to start with, I would think. So that's the first one on this list. The second one is going to be a work of fiction, completely different, but equally hefty. So this book, the second one I chose, is The Dying Grass by the author William T. Vollmann. I happen to be a huge fan of William T. Vollmann. I've read a lot of his works. I believe at least 10 of his books I've gone through. And this is one of the ones, interestingly enough, it's actually the first one of his books that I flipped through in terms of opening the pages and just starting the book. And it immediately grabbed my attention through its unusual structure. And maybe I can show on screen some of that strange indentation that he utilizes, where it seems like what he's doing is he's telling the narrative in the traditional third-person way, but then indenting with all sorts of interruptions or layers deeper within the characters, or just within something else happening at the same time or in the environment. As far as I know, he's not completely consistent with the meaning of these indentations. So the whole time that you're reading, you're interpreting why that indentation is there. You're interpreting what it could infer in terms of how the narrative is flowing. And that to me sounds very exciting, to read a book like that, that is playing with the structure of the text in order to get you thinking deeper about context and meaning the whole time that you're reading. Now, the actual subject matter of this book is in continuation with a series that he started called the Seven Dreams series. And what that is he has a series of narrative books where he is covering the effects of colonizers on the Native Americans in North America. And he has the book The Ice Shirt, which has to do with the Norse's interaction with the Inuit. He has Fathers and Crows, which has to do with the Jesuits' interactions with the Iroquois in Canada. Each book in the series is dealing with these interactions, and they're all part of the series, but they're all separate in terms of the actual novelization. They're all separate in terms of the narrative. This book, The Dying Grass, and you can read these books in any order, is dealing with the interactions between the early United States and the Nez Perce Indians, specifically the push westward from us, sort of forcing them away from their home and out further and further along the margins of the country. And this giant tome of a book follows through that march and all of the atrocities therein. So I look forward to the book for its textual experimentation, its density of history. There's hundreds of pages of endnotes at the back of this book. And so there's a lot of history contained within this fiction. It's a historical fiction in that sense. And so I look forward to just learning a lot, but also toying around with Vollmann's use of language and also some of the moral gray areas that he likes to play with in all of his books. So that's The Dying Grass. The next one that I'm going to react to, and by the way, part of my choices for this video is to make sure that I don't overlap with the videos done by the other booktubers who are linked in the description. So you can check out their videos and you're going to get a totally different list of 10 books. So there's a certain emphasis on obscurity with these choices, but these are books that I'm genuinely interested in finally diving into. And in fact, many of them are quite exciting to me for books to dive into. So the next one is what's called The Main Currents of Marxism. And this was originally 3 separate volumes, but it has been combined together into one book. So I'm just going to count it as one book. And this goes through the history of Marxist ideology. And as far as I can tell, based on the contents page, this book seems to devote most of the first two volumes to very early Marxist ideological history. A lot of the thinkers at the forefront and the ones who had influenced that Marxist ideology. It deals with that for the first two volumes. And then the third volume is when it finally gets into the Leninist or Stalinist deviation of Marxism and where that is continuous with or divergent from the prior forms of that ideology. So, as far as I can tell, it's written in such a way that it is extremely dense with ideas. Every chapter is its own kind of summation of what it is that each thinker was thinking in Marxism. However, there's also a kind of looseness to the writing style where the author seems to almost be tongue-in-cheek, just conversationally having a back and forth with you. This author's style seems a little bit friendly and inviting, even though the material is extremely dense. And that's just based on me just perusing a couple of chapters here and there and just getting a sense of the tone of voice in the book. And it really does feel like in spite of the fact that this is a difficult subject to get through, the author is really just trying to take us along for the ride in a fun way. Because sometimes the density of these ideas is actually half of the fun. And so it seems like this author is embracing that, at least a little bit. So that's the main currents of Marxism. If you're interested in the history of Marxism, it has an effect on the world, whether you like it or not, then this is a book to check out. This next book returns us back to a bit of experimental fiction, and that is the book Ha by Gordon Shepherd. And this is quite a thick tome, but it's unusual in a variety of ways. So, as far as I understand, it seems to be a documentarian, a film documentarian, who learned about a suicide of someone. I believe maybe it was a friend of the documentarian. And the whole book is his dive into the research into why that person took his own life and what were some of the effects of that choice or the things leading up to that choice. And there's something about the wife or the girlfriend of the person who did that to himself that ends up being a major part of the overall mystery. However, atop that mystery is a whole set of imagery and documents, and it's sort of this idea of playing with documents within the book itself, such that there's even a spot where you can find like a letter from the subject of the book. I'm not sure because I haven't read it yet, but it's interspersed in the middle of the text alongside lots of images and news articles and all sorts of other textual apparatus that seems to suggest this feeling of you being a detective along this mystery, just like the author was. And it kind of repeats that feel of a film documentary in the form of a book. And I look forward to that kind of experiment to see what it accomplishes for me as a reader, what it makes me feel, what's different about that kind of fictional style. In fact, I think I made a mistake earlier by calling it fiction. It really probably fits the genre of nonfiction better. However, I'm not sure because I would have to read it myself. I think it seems to me like a lot of the writing is made up by the author of the book. So it's using something in real life to then extrapolate a whole fictional apparatus around it. That's at least my impression of it. Again, it's one of those books that I look forward to reading. It's going to be very strange. It's another experimental novel of sorts. So it should be fun to see how much of it is fiction, how much of it is purely documentary, and what that mixture leads to and leaves me feeling. So that's the book Ha by Gordon Shepherd. The next book is by a formerly very famous writer, Stephen Jay Gould, and it is his giant book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. You can see how big that book is. And this seems to be a broad overview of his evolutionary view of nature. There are disputes within evolutionary theory in regards to the gradations of changes, or as Stephen Jay Gould put it, the punctuated equilibrium at play within evolution. And there are a whole range of different evolutions within evolutionary theory. And as far as I can tell, this book is a broad overview of those different branches of argument within evolutionary theory, and a major defense of Stephen Jay Gould's particular interpretation of the theory. And he comes at it from the perspective of, I believe, an archaeologist, someone who looks at fossils and the long tail of physical history as opposed to just the genetic side of things. I know that the gene view of evolutionary theory, such as propagated by someone like Richard Dawkins of the selfish gene, that is a bit different than how Stephen Jay Gould talks about it. I don't know all the specifics of how it's different, so that's why I want to read his book. I don't think, I would bet, that his theory is not going to be the most current one of evolutionary theory, but I've read other works by Stephen Jay Gould. I've read The Mismeasure of Man, where he talks about the various failings along the way to understanding IQ. And I've read a lot of his essays, which used to be collected in all these tiny little volumes over the years. And I find that he just has a knack for an entertaining prose style while not sacrificing the reality or specificity of various scientific theories. And he also seems genuinely to maintain a kind of humble skepticism of scientific theories, and I appreciate that along the way. Whether I agree with him or not, it is nice to just have an author try to be persuasive and balanced, informative, while also being slightly entertaining. So I think this should be an interesting book. I've read little tiny bits of it. It seems very, very, very dense compared to his more public-oriented, smaller essays. But I don't know, if you're interested in evolutionary theory, and you're really, really, really interested in it, this seems like a great book to kind of dive into. Okay, the next one is too many books for me to hold up. It's about 11 volumes. I've read the first volume, and I plan to periodically keep jumping in to the other ones. But this is Will and Ariel Durant's The Story of Civilization series. Each book within that series is close to 1,000 pages, and each book dives into a different period of time within history. And of course, this was written in like the 1950s or 1960s. It's going to contain all sorts of holdovers, bad habits of thinking, or maybe lack of evidence for certain kinds of historical periods. But the thing that I enjoy so much, and the reason why I wanted to read and still want to read the full series of The Story of Civilization, is the writing style of the book is fantastic. I think Will Durant, who was the prime writer at the beginning and became the co-writer with his wife as it went along, I think Will Durant, because his background is not as a historian, but as a philosopher, I think he ends up offering up a lot of insightful interpretations of what he's learning in history. And even though ultimately that means that a lot of this history is not going to be research that he does singularly himself, like some kind of new revelations of any kind, really what it's going to be is a history of our understanding of history, not really necessarily the truth about all that history per se, because he's not an actual historian who's really going to dive deep into the facts of each of the different pieces of documents that he could be looking at. But I do think that having that philosopher just kind of thinking through what he's learning about history as he's going through it, and for it to span these 11 volumes and to be written so beautifully, so consistently, I think that makes it worth sifting through. I know that this video is supposed to be about hard books. I think the only challenge with The Story of Civilization is the length of it, because actually the writing itself is so smooth and pleasurable. I really think I enjoy it like I would fiction. I'm not reading it with this idea that I'm getting every fact pristinely outlined. Instead, for me, I'm just taking pleasure in the smoothness of the writing style and just riding that wave the whole way through. So that is The Story of Civilization by Will and Ariel Durant. The next book is one that I chose only because I could not choose two other ones. In the other videos that do this topic, one of them had picked the book The Gulag Archipelago, which I definitely would have put up here, those 3 volumes. And they also had picked The House of Government, which I would have also put up, because both of those seem like fantastic pieces of Russian history. And I've been diving into a lot of Russian history lately, especially during Stalinism. But this next book is going to relate to that topic, and it's going to be similar to the Gulag Archipelago and similar to the House of Government in that it is focusing on people's thoughts at the time, their writings to each other at the time. It is about the individuals going through that experience. It is not merely a distant view of Russian history. It is a very close, intimate view of what it was like to be in this time period. And that book is The Whisperers by Orlando Figes. And it is subtitled Private Life in Stalin's Russia. So throughout the book, he goes through that full 30-year reign, I believe it was around 30 years, of Stalin, and the various changes in people's lives and the kinds of challenges they had to go through, some of the fixations that they had, some of the ways in which their world was changing rapidly around them. And he just focuses on the human voice. And of course, that will have the limitation of selection, like anything, like watching a documentary. Who the documentarian chooses to film gives you so much of the impression of that time, but that isn't necessarily something that you can extrapolate as a truth for everyone. But it doesn't change the fact that it is meaningful to at least get a sense of what some people were thinking some of the time during this period. And that is why I look forward to reading The Whisperers. And if there's anything difficult about this book, I think it's going to be the emotional strain, the strain of people living in a time of a lot of bad luck in terms of their condition. And I think that's going to be fascinating to get through, although it will be difficult. The next book I want to show, and this is number 8, I believe, is The Modern Mind by Peter Watson. I did not know about this book at all until I just stumbled on it at a bookstore. And it immediately grabbed my attention because it seems like an unusual way through history. It is a history of the 20th century, but it is a history of the ideas within the 20th century. So instead of focusing just on the politics of the time, on the major decisions that were affecting society, it is focusing on what are the broad concepts that were taking over in science, in mathematics, in physics, in philosophy, in literature, all of the various ways of interpreting the world, the different kinds of frameworks that we slip into. And it seems to just be almost like encyclopedic, but chronological through the 20th century. And that sounds fantastic. I imagine it's going to be difficult because, of course, it's going to be jumping from idea to idea, and some of these ideas are difficult to grasp. But it seems like we would be in good hands as readers with Peter Watson. I believe he worked as a journalist for a while, so he has a sense of how to communicate to a broad audience what would otherwise be quite complicated or dense. So it's probably the least difficult book that I have on this list, but it should be difficult just because it's going to be back to back to back to back ideas, and maybe you'll need a break along the way. And it is kind of lengthy. It's like 600 or 700 words. Now, the last 2 books on my list, I actually do not own yet, but I definitely want to own. They're both on my Amazon wish list, and I'm just waiting for when the price is at a much more reasonable range for me. The first book is The Matter with Things by Ian McGilchrist. And this is a recent release of his. It's 2 volumes thick, and it covers, as far as I understand, neuroscience, specifically the neuroscience of the split hemispheres of our brain and the ways in which each hemisphere seems to specialize or orient around a certain way of perceiving the world or processing what is perceived in the world. And then, as far as I know, it dives deep into a lot of metaphysics having to do with what we can know about the nature of matter itself or things as far as they exist. Now, the metaphysics makes me a little bit nervous because sometimes metaphysics is just playing with ideas without really being able to reach any kind of justification or conclusion. But like I said with the first book on this list, the metaethics one, I do think it can be fun just as a thought process to go through, almost like puzzling your way through an idea, just to practice your way of thinking and just to see if there's anything in that that makes you see something in a new way or just gives you more options of how to see things. So that book by him should be a lot of fun. I read his other book. I actually have it right behind me. It's called The Master and His Emissary. And that book was far more neuroscience focused because it was just breaking down the differences between the left and right hemisphere of the brain and why those differences matter. The second half did get a lot more philosophical, and that was an interesting half. I didn't buy into every single argument he was making. I felt like he was extrapolating slightly too far, but I did think it was a nice uh, rounding out of the scientific side of his argument, just for him to try and consider what would be the effects or the things that matter about this science. And so it would be nice to see those next two volumes. I imagine it's going to be just as dense, if not more so, than his book, The Master and His Emissary, but it should still be a nice experience with learning, just learning a little bit of neuroscience and some of the philosophy that maybe entails from that. The very last book that I want to cover, aside from the honorable mention that I'll just throw out, is going to be another book that I definitely do not own because it is way too expensive. Every time I look it up, it's something like $600 or $800 to buy, and that is Bottom's Dream by Arnold Smith. Now, I have a few of Arnold Smith's books, and if you know anything about Arnold Smith, you'll know that he is an extremely dense experimental writer. He tries to play with the forms of his fiction text in order to capture the nature of memory and the nature of experience. Often it's the punctuated nature of both, the way it can feel like segments. And that makes for some difficult reading in many ways. Although the book that I'm describing, Bottom's Dream, is his most difficult by far as I know. It is 1,500 or so pages. It is 3 columns, top to bottom, left to right, all the way through those pages. The left column seems to be all of the sensations that are going on for the characters. The middle volume seems to be the bulk of the narrative. And then the right volume is all of these little asides kind of interjecting in the midst of it. And it is hugely confusing. I have a PDF of the book and I've already kind of gone through the first few pages of it. It is extremely, extremely confusing, but there is a kind of sense to it that you can get used to as you go along. Like, it opens with the word king in the center, some cows mooing on the left margin, and on the right it says Noah Poke or Pho. And then you have to infer that the Noah Poke or Pho is just the beginning of the king in the center. So it's Noah Poking or Noah Pho. You get the idea. And so it's that kind of playfulness of just merging the left and right margins with the middle and thinking what is being communicated here. The thing that is probably hardest about the book is that there are no paragraph breaks, as far as I can tell. It's just one long wall of text. And so you have to make those breaks yourself. And that's probably the most irritating part of it. But if you imagine the breaks, it's not as bad as it seems. I think if you first look at it, it's the most confusing thing in the world. But what's satisfying about it, at least from what I've read in the PDF, is that once you begin to decipher that first page is going to be the hardest page. But once you begin to actually struggle your way through it, what you unlock in solving that puzzle remains unlocked as you go through the further pages, and it all starts to make some sense. So that is a book I'm really excited to eventually get and to eventually read through, because I actually think I am willing and motivated to get through that kind of book. I like that challenge. I like that kind of a puzzle. It's definitely not for everyone. Like with all of these books, these are hard books that I want to read, but you don't have to, and that's fine. And then the last book is just an honorable mention. The reason why it's here is it's a book that I want to reread. It's not a book I haven't read, so it doesn't really fit the rest of this list, but I do think it's a really great book, and that is The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper. It's a book that I read like a year and a half ago, and there is so much wrong with the book. There's so much about his exegesis of Plato and Hegel and Marx that is faulty, and yet, in spite of the point of fact of those faults, in spite of all of the various failings of his interpretation, he still manages to crumble together truly brilliant insights into the nature of the demarcation of science and non-science, and what we as a society perhaps can decide for one another in terms of what's best. And the way in which he builds his argument was so satisfying to me. And I found, interestingly enough, that the endnotes actually contain the most insightful parts of the whole book. But I really loved chewing on his arguments the whole way through. And I didn't agree with everything that he said. I don't know that I've ever read an author where I agree with everything that they said, but I found that the kind of chewing that I was able to do with that book was really useful to me. And that is what has mattered. And so that is my list of the 10/11 hard books that I am excited to read or reread in the case of the last book. And you don't have to read them. You don't have to care. You don't have to like them. But if you're interested in some hard books, those are some options for you. I hope you enjoyed that. I would love to hear some of the books that you'd be interested in reading. If you have a BookTube channel, please do your own response. The more books that are piled on to these lists that we're accumulating, the better, because it just gives more food for thought, more opportunities to get some great books to read in the future. So thanks for watching my video, and I'll see you around. And as usual, like and subscribe, do all that kind of stuff. But most importantly, just leave some comments and tell me what you think. Have you read some of these books? Are there books that I'm missing that you think that I would really enjoy that I just haven't heard about yet? Let me know. Thanks.